All right, let's kick off this deep dive. We're going to be tackling a question that always seems to get people fired up. Can science actually disprove God?
It's a big one, for sure.
Yeah, and we're diving deep into a Reddit thread on this topic. And, well, it's safe to say there are some strong opinions out there.
Oh, absolutely. Lots of back and forth. It gets pretty intense in there. It really shows how much this intersection of science and religion matters to people.
Definitely. And while we won't be definitively answering this age-old question today,
Right, right.
we did find 3 key insights from this Reddit thread.
Ooh, sneak peek time.
Sneak peek time.
All right, so first up, we're going to be looking at the limits of science itself.
Can it really even touch these big supernatural questions?
Yeah.
Or are we asking it to do something it just wasn't built for?
Then we'll tackle this idea of the God of the gaps. It's where God is, well, kind of used as a placeholder for anything science hasn't figured out yet.
We'll see how this plays out with some real-world examples and how it can lead to some interesting logic. And finally, we'll explore why faith is still so powerful. Why do people hold on to beliefs even when science may challenge them?
So, listeners, get ready for a deep dive into science, religion, and the human search for meaning.
Sounds like a plan. Let's jump into that first insight,
That's right.
the limits of science. So a lot of the debate in this Reddit thread really comes down to what science can tell us about God, right?
Yep.
Like, some users believe that if there was evidence for God, science would found it by now.
Yeah.
One user saves, they say, because we haven't found that proof. Well, science suggests God doesn't exist.
That's a pretty common argument, but it makes you think, what kind of evidence are we even talking about here?
Right.
Because science is really good at examining the natural world, what we can see, touch, measure.
It's all about observing, testing, hard facts.
Exactly. But what happens when we try to apply that to something that might exist outside of that?
It's like trying to use a ruler to measure, I don't know, like happiness or something. It's just the wrong tool for the job.
It is. It is.
And one user, Clark, they brought a good point. They say if God doesn't interact with our world in a way we can observe, then maybe science isn't the right way to even approach this question.
That makes sense.
They argue that if God was messing around with, like, physics or biology, we'd see the evidence. But if God's kind of hands-off, well, then it all comes down to faith, not something science can prove or disprove.
Right. And it's like that analogy someone else made in the thread about a sentient French-speaking toaster living on Jupiter just because we haven't found it.
Wait, what?
Yeah, I know, right?
Okay, I got to hear more about this toaster.
So just because we haven't found this super smart French-speaking toaster
Still can't get over that.
doesn't actually mean it doesn't exist, right? But it makes you pretty skeptical.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Lack of evidence might not be proof, but it can definitely make you doubt.
Okay, so applying that back to God, I guess the lack of hard scientific evidence might make some people doubt God's existence, even if it doesn't technically disprove it.
Exactly. It's an important difference there. Just because we haven't found evidence doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But it does, make you wonder, makes you think about different possibilities.
Makes you think, for sure. So it feels like this whole debate comes back to whether or not a God would leave, like a trace.
Yeah, tangible evidence.
Like, if they were actively shaping the universe,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't science be able to see that? But if God's more of a distant observer...
Maybe science will never detect them. So then what? Can we even talk about God if science hits a wall?
It's a good question.
It is. And that's where that second insight comes in.
The God of the gaps.
That's the one. And this is where things get really interesting.
All right, God of the gaps. Lay it on me.
Okay, so it's a way more common way of thinking than you might realize, especially when we talk about science and religion. Basically, it's like whenever science can't fully explain something, some people jump in and say, well, God must have done it.
So using God as a way to fill in the blanks.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like a cosmic placeholder for all the stuff we haven't figured out yet. And I get it, we like explanations for things. When we're faced with something we don't understand, it's kind of comforting to say, oh, well, it must be God's doing.
Makes it all neat and tidy.
Right. But the thing is, as science learns more, those gaps, those mysteries, they start to shrink. What we used to think was supernatural, well, eventually science comes up with an explanation.
So we keep pushing God further and further back with every new discovery.
Exactly. And there are some great examples of this in the Reddit thread, like take evolution. Before Darwin came along, a lot of people believed that God created every species individually. Boom, there they are.
Oof.
But then evolution came along and said, hold on, Maybe life on Earth developed gradually over millions of years through natural processes.
No need for a grand magic trick.
Nope. And, well, I'm sure you can imagine that didn't go over well with everyone, especially those who take religious texts very literally.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a tough pill to swallow.
One user, Successful Mall 3825, they brought up how evolution clashes with certain biblical claims, like a young Earth or Adam and Eve being literal historical figures. And that leaves some people of faith having to kind of reconcile their beliefs with what science is telling us, which can be a real challenge for sure.
It's like what you were saying before about the goalposts constantly shifting. Every time science explains one thing, the need for a divine explanation just jumps to something else we don't understand yet.
Exactly. And someone else in the thread mentioned the fine-tuning argument, which is another classic example of this God of the gaps thinking.
Fine-tuning, that rings a bell. It's the idea that all the physical laws of the universe are perfectly set up for life to exist.
Right, like the universe is a finely tuned instrument, and the argument is this perfect setup points to a designer, to God. But, as we've learned more about cosmology, about the vastness of the universe and how it all works.
We found natural explanations for why things are the way they are.
Yeah, more and more. Which means that gap, the need for a divine explanation, is shrinking yet again.
So it's a never-ending game of cosmic hide-and-seek. Science finds God hiding in one gap, God jumps to another.
Something like that. But I think it highlights a really important point. When you rely on God as the explanation for everything we don't understand yet, it can be a pretty unstable foundation for your faith. Because as we learn more, those gaps keep closing.
Makes you wonder then, what role faith does have in a world where science is constantly explaining more and more. So where does this all leave faith? Because looking at this Reddit thread, it's clear that faith still means a lot to people, even if it's not, scientifically provable.
Right. I think that's what makes faith so interesting. It works on a totally different level than science.
Yeah. It's not about experiments and hard data. It's about
personal conviction, right? Feeling connected to something bigger than yourself.
and those feelings, that connection, it can be really powerful for people.
Oh, absolutely. Life-changing even.
Like Altruistic Race 5941, who started this whole thread. They talked about how believing their grandfather was with God after he died, well, it really helped them cope with the loss.
Faith can bring so much comfort, especially when we're dealing with the big, difficult questions. The stuff science doesn't always have answers for.
Like, why are we here? What happens when we die? Is there some grand plan? Science might not have those answers, but faith can step in and offer, well, hope, guidance.
And I think it reminds us that we're not just thinking machines, right? We're not just logic and reason. We have emotional and spiritual needs too. Science can't always address those.
Makes sense. It's not about picking sides, science versus religion. It's more about
recognizing they both have something to offer.
two different ways of looking at the world, but both valuable.
Exactly.
But I do have to bring up something that came up in the thread. The idea of, I think they called them unfalsifiable claims. Basically, beliefs that science can't prove or disprove.
Oh, yeah.
Like if I said there's an invisible dragon living in my garage, no scientist could prove me wrong,
Right. No experiment for that.
And I guess some aspects of faith might be like that too. If you believe in a God that exists outside of the universe, beyond our ability to see or measure, well, science can't really say anything about that. It becomes a matter of personal belief.
Exactly. And that leads us to this interesting paradox. Science, which is all about evidence and testing, might not be the right tool to judge certain faith-based beliefs. But that doesn't mean those beliefs are wrong, or that faith itself isn't important.
So it seems like we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at the limits of science, talked about the God of the gaps idea, and seen how faith can offer meaning even when science can't provide all the answers. What's the takeaway message you want to leave our listeners with?
Maybe this. If a God does exist, but is beyond our scientific understanding, does it really change how we live our lives? Maybe the more important question is how our beliefs, whether they're based on faith or reason, shape our actions and how we treat each other, how we treat the world.
That's a really powerful thought.
It's
It's not about proving God. It's about how our beliefs, whatever they may be, guide us.
Exactly. And I think that's a conversation that goes way beyond this Reddit thread. It's something we should all think about as we navigate our own beliefs and values and the choices we make every day.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We hope this deep dive has given you some new things to think about and maybe even challenged a few old assumptions. Keep those minds curious and keep those conversations going.